It took just a few minutes to lift this rusted car out of Bruley Creek. It's been resting in this area for more than 40 years. But the process was grueling. Investigators spent hours digging around the car and picking out what's inside, human remains and other items.
On May 29, 1971, two teenage girls named Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller went missing in South Dakota. And despite a massive search effort and years of investigation, their fate remained unknown. That is, until a stunning discovery was made in 2013, revealing the tragic truth behind their disappearance. This case has baffled investigators and fascinated the public, and it is still a very intriguing mystery that people can't stop thinking about. This is the story of the vanishing of Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller, and the decades-long search for answers that finally came to an end. How did the investigators find them? Could it be that the girls were still alive and living a happy, independent life? Let's find out. Hi, and welcome to Real Crime Storytime, where we cover solved, unsolved, and mysterious cases from across the globe. And today, we are looking at another case with the most insane twist you have ever heard. If you haven't already, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel to get the latest crime stories directly to your inbox. Without further ado, let's dive deep into the story. In 1971, Vermilion, South Dakota was a small college town with a population of around 5,000 people. It was home to the University of South Dakota, a public university with a strong reputation for liberal arts and professional programs. The town itself was located in the southeastern part of the state, along the Missouri River. It had a relatively quiet and laid-back atmosphere with a mix of small businesses and residential areas. In terms of cultural and entertainment options, Vermilion had a few small restaurants, bars and shops, as well as a movie theater and a bowling alley. The town also had several parks and recreational areas, including the Missouri National Recreational River. It was a small but vibrant college town with a strong sense of community and a focus on education and culture. But this small and vibrant town was to encounter a disaster that would haunt the community for decades to come. Cheryl Miller and Pamela Jackson were both 17 years old. Cheryl Miller was known as Sherry by her friends. Sherry's journey began on November 16, 1953 in Vermilion, South Dakota, where she was welcomed into the world by her parents, Melvin and Helen Miller. She had three siblings, namely Alan, Rita, and Don. From a young age, it was evident that Sherry possessed a kind and caring nature, which made her a natural at making friends. Her outgoing personality and cheerful demeanor made her a favorite among her peers. During her high school years, Sherry's talents extended beyond her social skills. She was a skilled baton twirler and was part of the cheerleading squad, where she shone brightly, entertaining and inspiring the crowd with her impressive performances. Her time in high school was a defining period, shaping her character and preparing her for the journey ahead. Despite being close to her brother, Alan, and her two sisters, Rita and Dawn, Sherry's family life was far from perfect. By the time she turned 17, her parents, Melvin and Helen, had split up, leaving her to navigate the challenges of growing up in a broken family. This was a difficult period for Shelley, as her parents' separation had left her feeling lost and alone. To make matters worse, her mother got remarried to a man named Leonard, further disrupting the family dynamics. Although this situation brought Sherry and Alan closer as siblings, it was a difficult time for Sherry, who had come to terms with the fact that her family was no longer what it used to be. Despite these challenges, Sherry remained strong and determined to overcome whatever obstacles came her way. When her mother left to live with Leonard, Sherry found comfort in the loving embrace of her grandparents, Nick and Pearl Jensen. Sherry adapted to this new situation with ease, and her natural kindness and intelligence shone through in the way she looked after her grandmother, who was terminally ill with cancer. Sherry took on many household responsibilities, including cooking and chores without complaint. Despite these challenges, Sherry never lost sight of her dreams. She had always aspired to California to pursue a career in fashion design, and her talent for sewing made this seem like a possibility. At the Dakota Hospital, where she worked after school, she met her close friend Pamela Jackson, better known as Pam. Together, they shared a love for the clothing industry and often baked treats for their friends, making their school and community a sweeter place. Pam had a more stable home life. She was the daughter of Oscar and Adele Jackson. Pam's family had a beautiful farm, and they were known for being kind and hospitable. Her father, Oscar, had grown up on a farm nearby in Vermilion and loved to share his time with others, making delicious cookies and coffee for all their friends. Pam was a talented seamstress, just like her mother, Adele, and often went out of her way to do sweet things for her friends, like hosting cozy slumber parties or baking yummy treats. Both Pam and Sherry were loved by their school and community due to their infectious personalities and generous hearts. But, despite being great human beings, taking care of their families and loving their friends, they were about to be tested by the toughest challenge of their lives. It was a warm evening on May 29, 1971, and Sherry was on her way to a party at a local gravel quarry. She had been invited by some friends from school, but she didn't want to go alone. Sherry's popularity didn't make her immune to fear, and she wanted the company of her friend Pam and cousin Pam Stewart. Unfortunately, Pam Stewart couldn't make it because of a last-minute babysitting emergency. Sherry's grandma was unwell and stayed at the hospital where both the girls worked. Before leaving for the party, they decided to visit her grandmother. They stayed at the hospital until around 9:30 p.m. and then headed to the parking lot of a local church to meet their friends. As they got ready to leave, a strange feeling began to take over them. Something wasn't right, and they couldn't put their finger on it. They got into Sherry's grandparents' car, a beige 1960 Studebaker Lark, and they started their journey to the quarry. The darkness enveloped them, and the road ahead was barely visible. As Sherry and Pam drove their Studebaker towards the quarry, they followed a car filled with boys from their school who promised to lead them to a party. However, as they drove, the boys made a mistake by going too far ahead, and the girls took a wrong turn. The girls soon disappeared from the boys' sight, and they couldn't find them anywhere. Despite frantic searching and calling out their names, the girls were nowhere to be found. Their classmates grew increasingly concerned as the night wore on, and the girls failed to show up at the party. Sherry and Pam were known to be responsible and sensible girls, which made their sudden disappearance all the more worrying. The clock had long since ticked past 9:30 p.m., and the darkness of the night had fully set in. The friends tried to dismiss the unsettling feeling that was beginning to gnaw at them, hoping that the girls would soon arrive at the party and they could forget their worries. Adele, Pam's mom, would leave the kitchen light on for Pam when she was out late, so she could see when she got home. Pam usually turned it off once she was inside. At 4 a.m., Pam's mother Adele noticed the kitchen light was still on, and Pam was nowhere to be found. They guessed that maybe she had car troubles or spent the night at a friend's house, but when they checked to see where she could be, no one had seen her. Frantic, they called the police, but the cops initially assumed she was just another runaway kid, given the free-spirited culture of the time. It wasn't until they learned of some details that didn't add up with this theory that they began to take the case more seriously. Time was ticking, and the clock was against them. The girls had no luggage and hadn't collected their paychecks, which didn't fit the runaway theory. But why would Sherry leave her sick grandmother whom she cared for? Maybe it became too much for her. These were just theories floating around, but maybe visiting her grandmother that night was just a way of saying the last goodbye. The gravel pit and surrounding areas were searched, but the girls weren't found. Despite searching the Missouri River, they still couldn't find anything, and because of the lack of technology, searches were much more difficult back then. People suggested draining the river or sending divers in, but it was deemed too dangerous. Police initially believed the girls had run away. Unfortunately, Sherry's grandmother died 6 days after they disappeared. The police gave up and labeled it a runaway case, despite the inconsistencies. But Pam's father, Oscar, refused to give up. He tirelessly searched the nearby areas, even looking through photos of unidentified deceased women. Can you imagine the heartbreak of searching for your own child among them? He checked his daughter's social security number repeatedly, hoping for a sign of her or her friend, but found nothing. It was as if they vanished into thin air. Unfortunately, the girls were never found, and the case went cold. For over 30 years, the families were left without answers, with no clues to bring them closure. But now 2 new characters will be introduced. A woman known only as DH or Dahlia, and a man named David Lycan. In 1989, Dahlia separated from her husband of 16 years, with whom she had 2 children. In early 1990, Dahlia met David Lycan in her computer class at the University of South Dakota, while also working part-time as a church secretary. They began dating, and things seemed normal at first. However, David soon became possessive and involved himself in her divorce proceedings with her ex-husband. On June 11, 1990, Dahlia received her divorce papers, but her new boyfriend, David Lycan, was more upset than she was. He talked about killing himself and how his property should be divided when he died. This erratic behavior led Dahlia to break up with him. David continued to show up at her home uninvited throughout June and July of 1990, which constituted stalking and harassment. Things turned for the worse on July 9, when Dahlia received her divorce decree. David called, demanding to talk despite her saying she wasn't up to it. Later that night, he called again, claiming he had a message from God and wanted to pray with her. The next morning, David called Dahlia's friend Jerome, crying and agitated about her child custody order. What was his interest in her children? Something about his behavior just didn't add up. In the middle of the night, at about 1:15 a.m. on July 10, 1990, Dahlia was jolted awake by a haunting presence in her bedroom. It was David, and he was sitting on the edge of her bed. Dahlia couldn't see him in the darkness, but she heard his voice, pleading with her to love him. David turned on the light, and Dahlia hoped that he was finally leaving, but instead, he made a horrifying demand. He wanted to make love to her one last time before he died. She tried to resist, but he forced himself on her. As he sexually assaulted her, he whispered terrifying things in her ear, saying that he should kill her ex-husband before he killed himself. Dahlia's mind raced with thoughts of her children and the trauma they might be experiencing if they heard what was happening. At around 4:15 a.m., David finally finished his heinous act and asked Dahlia if she wanted to call the police. But Dahlia was too terrified to do so and pleaded with him to leave before her children woke up. After David left, Dahlia was left alone with the traumatic experience she had just endured. The next morning, when she finally reached out to her friend Jerome at 9 a.m., it was clear that Dahlia was deeply affected by what had happened. They agreed that the safety of the children was the top priority, and only then could they seek help from her minister and eventually call the police. After Dahlia escaped from David's grasp, he was relentless in his pursuit, trying to block her car with his pickup truck as she raced through the streets of Vermilion. But Dahlia was determined to protect her children and managed to drop them off at a safe location before returning to Vermilion to seek refuge with her minister. Even there, David attempted to track her down, driving by the house like a predator on the hunt. With the help of her minister and the tenacious detective Ray Hoffman, they were able to gather the evidence needed to put David behind bars for a long time. Finally, after a trial, the verdict was in. On February 7, 1991, David was sentenced to 225 years in prison. It was the conclusion to a story of survival and justice. You might be wondering how the story of David Lycan is related to the original story we were told. It turns out that David Lycan the man responsible for the horrifying events we just heard about, had some unexpected ties to the girls we were previously discussing. He attended the same church as Pam Jackson and Cheryl Miller, and even rode the bus with Sherry back in the late 1960s. This connection brings us to the events of June 2004. South Dakota formed a new department to investigate cold cases, and among them was the case of Pam Jackson and Sherry Miller. David Lycan, a convicted rapist and a former church member who rode the same bus as Sherry, became a suspect in this case. During the investigation, David Lycan's younger sister drew the attention of law enforcement when she became emotional while discussing a burn pit on their family farm, which was used by David. She recalled seeing a light-colored car parked near the gas tanks, similar to the one Pam Jackson and Cheryl Miller were driving when they disappeared. Further questioning led to her identifying the car, a Studebaker-Lark in a lineup, and even providing a chilling testimony that she saw Cheryl lying over the steering wheel and Pam with her head on the passenger window. This revelation was too significant for law enforcement to ignore and became a major lead in the case. The investigators obtained a search warrant for the farm in Alcester, South Dakota, where David Lycan had lived in 1971, the year the girls disappeared. On August 24, 2004, they executed the search warrant using heavy equipment to dig up the property, but their search for the car proved fruitless. But they didn't give up. In October 2004, they conducted another interview with the sister, who was put under hypnosis, and this is where things get wild. She vividly recalled hearing a gunshot and then seeing two teenagers' bodies in a wheelbarrow on the farm. She even mentioned a tractor and grinder being used and how the girls were ground into feed. She also mentioned that when she came out to see what was happening, David choked her and she became unconscious. In November 2004, they interviewed the sister again, who described seeing clothing on the farm similar to what the girls' families had described. They also spoke with Ed Ekron, a former Union County sheriff who had searched for the girls at the time of their disappearance. He recalled visiting the Lycan family residence and noticing David's sister seemed very nervous. This led to a second search warrant for the farm in November 2004, but once again, nothing was found. In 2006, they obtained another search warrant for David Lycan's farm and finally found some concrete evidence. They discovered a Bible with strands of hair and newspaper clippings about the disappearance of Pam and Sherry, which directly linked him to the case. They also found clothing, photographs, and even bones on the property. The case was an absolute roller coaster ride of twists and turns, leaving everyone gripping the edge of their seats in anticipation. In a stunning turn of events, an inmate by the name of Black Crow claimed in March of that year that David Lycan had confessed to killing the two girls. Black Crow was outfitted with a wire and secretly recorded conversations with Lycan in the prison library, and the evidence obtained from the recordings was enough to charge Lycan with the murders in July of 2007. The question on everyone's minds was, how could someone commit such heinous crimes and not confess earlier? Was Lycan so desensitized to violence that he didn't care about admitting to the murders? But David Lycan was exactly that sort of man, as his criminal record would show. In 1977, David Lycan assaulted his wife just 4 months into their marriage. He even threatened to kill her son. Then in 1982, he physically abused a cafe waitress who tried to break up with him and threatened to kill her parents. In 1983, he kidnapped a woman he had dated for 3 months. He assaulted her and then broke into her son's apartment and assaulted her again. But he was only charged with burglary. In January 1986, he met his fourth victim at a singles Christian conference, but she rejected him. In March 1986, he showed up at her home, ranted about how God told him she loved him, then strangled and assaulted her, threatening to kill her and her children if she reported him. He even followed her home. All of this history made his confession to the murder of Pam and Sherry even more believable. The trial was supposed to bring justice for the heinous crime committed, but just as it was about to begin in March 2008, the story took yet another twist. The events that took place during this crime were truly shocking and left a lasting impact on the public. But as we all know, the real shocker was yet to come. The charges were unexpectedly dropped just weeks before the trial, when it was revealed that the tape did not feature David Lycan's voice after all. Instead, it was another inmate who had been asked by David Crow to confess and pretend to be Lycan. The discovery left everyone dismayed, especially considering there was a clear motive for Black Crow's actions. His desperate attempt to curry favor with the authorities had backfired, and he was charged with perjury. Despite the compelling testimony of Lycan's sister and the suspicious evidence found at the farm, the case hit a dead end once again. The next 5 years passed without any significant breakthroughs, leaving everyone involved disappointed and disheartened. But again, in a stunning turn of events, a discovery was made on September 23, 2013, more than 42 years after the girls disappeared. A fisherman exploring the area around Brill Creek, located between Vermilion and Alcester in South Dakota, made a jaw-dropping find. Due to the water level being unusually low because of a drought in the region, he noticed something peculiar: tires protruding from the water. Upon closer inspection, he spotted an overturned vehicle resting at the bottom of the creek. The fisherman immediately alerted the authorities, and upon investigation, they removed one of the hubcaps from the car. The hubcap was identified as belonging to a 1960 Studebaker Lark, the exact model of car the girls had been driving on that fateful day. The odds of finding the same car model in a creek between the girls' hometown and the residence of David Lycan were staggering. As they examined the vehicle, they made a startling discovery. The license plate confirmed that it had belonged to Sherry's grandfather. The car was the very one the girls had been driving all those years ago, and what they found inside the vehicle was nothing short of remarkable. The evidence they discovered inside the car was frozen in time, providing a vivid snapshot of what happened that fateful night. The watch that they found, still ticking, had stopped at precisely 10:20 p.m. But that wasn't all. They also discovered Sherry's purse, complete with her driver's license, coins, a key, and notes from her classmates. Now remember, if the watch stopped at 10:20 p.m., this was 50 minutes after they met at the church parking lot at 9:30. The evidence found in the vehicle provided a clear picture of the events leading up to the girls' disappearance. The car was found with the keys in the ignition and in third gear, and the headlights were still switched on. The severely damaged tire suggested that the car was being driven normally when it went into the creek. Perhaps the most telling evidence was the human remains found inside the car. The bodies were fully clothed and sitting in the front seat, indicating that they had been driving to the quarry. DNA tests confirmed that the remains were those of Pam and Sherry. Remarkably, there was no indication of foul play, and all signs pointed toward a tragic accident. The girls showed no signs of intoxication, and the authorities believed that dust impaired Sherry's vision and caused her to miss a new bridge that was still under construction, leading to their tragic accident. No foul play was suspected, and it was determined that David Lycan had nothing to do with it. His sister's accusations were just a desperate attempt for attention, and she had always harbored resentment towards him. Some saw him as a victim, wrongfully charged with a crime he didn't commit. However, with 225 years already tacked onto his sentence, it made little difference. Finally, the case was closed, this time for good. The story of the disappearance of Pam and Sherry was filled with countless twists and turns. All the other stories that somehow converged into the story of these girls were haunting enough to disrupt anyone's sleep. Why did Dahlia suffer so much? What did all the victims of David do to encounter this fate? What was the reason behind David's sister telling on him? And how desperate was Crow that he fabricated a piece of evidence that was not even evidence in the first place? The twist in this case was nothing short of mind-bending and surreal, leaving all those involved in stunned silence. It was a rare occurrence that shook the very foundations of what people believed they understood about human nature, leaving them questioning the very fabric of their existence. But perhaps the saddest part of it all was the fate of Pam's father, Oscar. He searched tirelessly for his daughter for 42 long years, never giving up hope. He combed through photos of deceased people, searched every possible place he could think of, and yet he never found her. And just 5 days before the car was finally discovered, he passed away at the age of 102, still without the closure he so desperately sought. It's a tragic end to an unending saga that spanned decades, filled with heartbreak and unanswered questions. And while the discovery of the car finally brings some closure, it can never fully ease the pain and sorrow that has plagued the families of Pam and Sherry for so many years. The case of Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller is a heartbreaking story that remained a mystery for over 42 years. It's amazing to see how new developments and technology can solve cases that have been cold for decades. But do you think that David was wronged by the law for getting blamed? And do you think that the case could have been handled better if the police searched for the vehicle in the river right after the girls disappeared? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories and updates on ongoing investigations.